So welcome back to Chapter 2. Here we're going to talk about building our first web page. And we'll talk about how to code it, we'll talk about how to test it, as well as we'll talk about how to validate it. So our objectives for today, we want to make sure you know how to use a text editor to create and edit HTML and CSS files. We'll talk about how to test HTML files that you store locally on your computer. We'll talk about how to validate them using the using the W3C validation service. They've got one. There's one for HTML as well as one for CSS. We'll kind of look at both. We'll talk about the purpose of the head and the body tags in an HTML document or elements. We'll also talk about a few different kinds of tags. We'll talk about opening tags. We'll talk about closing tags. We'll talk about empty tags as well. And then we'll talk about how attributes work and how we add them to our HTML tags. We'll talk about how to use comments and how to add whitespace to an HTML document. We'll go over some of the parts and components of CSS rules and how to create a CSS spreadsheet, a style sheet. We'll talk about different kinds of selectors. We'll talk about the type selector, the ID selector, and the class selector. There are a lot of other selectors out there. We're just going to start with those three basic types. We'll also talk about a few different ways to run and test your source code, and talk about some of the benefits of validating HTML files. So the basic structure of an HTML document looks like this. This top tag here that we have, the doc type declaration, okay, that is used to define that our document is an HTML5 document. And that says what sort of standards it follows and how the browser should kind of deal with it and handle it. So that's important. We want to add that to the top of all of our web pages. The next thing that we have in there is kind of, we start at the root of the tree is this HTML tag. Okay, so you can kind of see the beginning of it here and the end of it here. And then within that we have the head and we have the body. So the head contains content that's not really part of the page, as we would say. It's generally metadata around the page. What is in there as well is the little text that shows up in the title bar of your in the tab. So the name of the tab will show up in there, as well as metadata, and then the body is where the actual content of the page is. Okay, so anything you really see on the page will be in the body. What's in the head is more metadata. It's information about the page. Okay, that's used by the browser as well as the search engine. So an example of what that might look like. Here's kind of a simple web page. So we've got the doc type up top. We've got the start of the HTML tag, the end of the HTML tag. Within that, then we've got the head and we've got the body. So this body contains a header and a few paragraphs, which is what you would see if you would open this page. And in the head, we've got a meta tag, which tells us what character set is used to encode this text file. Here it's UTF-8. That's generally what it's going to be for as long as you're writing in English. If you were, say, writing in Chinese, you might use something different. But for us, that's always going to be UTF-8. So meta character set UTF-8. Title, that's what's going to show up in two places. The title is going to show up in the tab, the name of the tab or the name of the window, and it will also show up in the search engine results. So if you find this page in the search engine, what shows up as the name of that page is this title. So that title is actually pretty important. As far as working with tags, most tags will have a beginning or an opening tag as well as a closing tag. So if we're looking at here, we've got the header tag You see it starts with an H1 that's an opening tag, and it ends with an H1 that's a closing tag. Difference being, notice that there's no slashes in here. There's a slash that begins it. So less than slash H1 greater than. This is the closing tag. Same way with here. So we have the starting tag, the start of the paragraph, and the end of the paragraph tag. Okay. Some tags don't have closing tags that go with them. Most tags do, but some tags don't. And in fact, with these ones, if you add a closing tag, that would be an error. So these are what we refer as empty tags because they don't have a closing tag, or they don't have any content, right? So the stuff between the start and the end of the tag is often referred to as the content of that tag, which is where they're empty because they don't have any content. So BR for break row, that tag does not have a closing tag. The image tag as well does not have a closing tag, so it's just image. And that's basically because the way we specify the image that actually displays it with this little source equals blah. That's the actual content of the actual image we're showing. So one thing to keep in mind as you're writing tags is you need to use the proper nesting. Don't use incorrect nesting. So here this is fine. You have a paragraph tag, and inside of that paragraph tag is an italic tag. That's okay. It's an I tag. It's fine. But you can see it's perfectly bounded. The start and the end is inside of the paragraph. What you don't want to do, and what's technically invalid, even though the browser will allow you to do it, is to write it like this, where you start the P tag, you start the I tag, and then you close the P tag before closing the I tag. This means that they're not actually nested. So if we were thinking of this kind of in terms of a Venn diagram, the first example would be, okay, you have the paragraph tag, and then inside of that is perfectly contained the I tag. Versus if we were to look at the second example, that would be like two overlapping rings, where you have the P tag and the I tag, but there's an overlap area in between them. Whereas this one, it's perfectly contained. That's important because this part's important because when we actually go to render it in the browser has to take all the code that you write from the way you've written as tags into a tree, because what it actually displays is a tree of tags, and that's important, especially because of that'll come into play as we do indentation and whitespace on this. So if we want to add attributes to a tag, specifically we'll add it to the opening tag. Basically any attribute, any tag in HTML can have attributes, but there's only certain attributes that are valid for that particular tag. So you have to kind of know that tag and know what attributes are valid for that particular tag. So for instance, if I have an A tag, which we refer to as an anchor tag, we might add a single attribute to it like this. So here I say href is equal to contact.html, right? So there's an attribute. Here's the name of the attribute and the value of that attribute, or we might say the key and the value. Similar thing here. This is a tag with 3 attributes. So I have href is equal to blah, title is equal to blah, and class is equal to blah. So it's got 3 different attributes. It's important to remember that these attributes always go on the opening tag. You cannot put them on the closing tag. Similarly, if you're working with empty tags, they're on the tag. Okay. So if I'm going to add attributes to an empty tag, it just looks like this. It just looks like it would on an opening tag. It's just that there's no closing tag. Okay. So I can also add Boolean attributes for some tags. So most attributes have kind of a key and a value. Some attributes, which we call Boolean attributes, they don't have a value. You just code them here like checked, and that will set it to true, versus the other way it would be effectively false. So you just turn it off and on by adding a keyword. Okay. There are a few different attributes that are commonly used to identify tags within our HTML. These we then refer to in both the CSS as well as the JavaScript will refer to these attributes. So one thing we can do is we can add an ID attribute to really any tag, or we can add a class attribute to any tag. The ID has to be unique in that page. There cannot be two tags with the same ID. That's technically illegal per HTML. Your browser will still open it and run it if there are two tags with the same ID, but that's technically not legal HTML, and you will run into some issues when it comes to working with the JavaScript if two tags have the same ID. So an ID is uniquely saying, here's the ID of here's the ID or the name that uniquely identifies this tag in my document. And then a class is used to define a group of tags. So more than one tag can have the same class. And in fact, any tag can actually have more than one class. So in this case, we're saying this div tag has an ID of page. This anchor tag has a class of nav_link. Okay. I can also add comments to my document. Sometimes I use these to give some additional information to kind of explain what's going on. That would be one way to use a comment. The other way to do is to kind of remove code from the document, at least for testing purposes, to see what does it look like. For instance, what if that's not there? So you can temporarily remove it with a comment as well. So a comment looks like this. It starts with less than, exclamation mark, dash dash, ends with dash dash, greater than. You'll notice that I have a beginning to it. I have an end to it. I do have to include both. If you just leave off one, then the rest of the document will be treated as if it's commented out. So make sure that when you start a comment that you also end it. Similarly, down here, we're commenting out some HTML code, so this code would not be represented in the browser. You wouldn't see the text of this comment, and then you wouldn't see this HTML as well. All of that is going to disappear when you actually look at the document in the browser. You would still see this if you go view the source code. If you right-click and view source, you will still see this comment here and everything inside of it, but it won't actually show up normally in the browser. Do note that because they have a start and they have an end, they're what we typically call block comments in most languages. HTML does not have what we would call a single line comment. It only has block comments. So that's worth noting, especially if you're familiar with some other languages. We can't just do a / to comment out a single line. You have to do the beginning and the end to comment out that block. Okay. So that's the basic structure of HTML. So let's move on to talking about CSS. So when we're making a CSS file, it's composed of a set of rules. So for each of those rules, it needs a selector, which is what we have here at the beginning. And then we have a pair of curly braces that define, well, what properties do we want to actually change on that particular group of things. So here our selector is H1. Here we've got a property. We're going to change the color. And we're going to say we're going to change the color to navy. So inside this line here with a semicolon at the end is referred to as a declaration. So the whole block is a rule. The individual line in there that says color : navy is a declaration. Okay, so an example of what this might look like there's some comments in here too, is like such. So here we're going to say to the entire body, I'm going to apply a background color, and here is the background color that I want to use. We haven't gotten into Xcodes. We'll talk about that in a later chapter about what this actually means. But here effectively we're saying that this is going to make the background orange. Okay. I'm also going to change the color of the H1s. So the H1s are going to be this color here. That should be gray, if I'm not mistaken. The H2s, you can see they're going to be italic. And we're also giving them a border bottom. So they're going to have a border on the bottom of them, or a line on the bottom of them. So you see this is being applied to the H1s, and this is being applied to the H2s. So those different tags are going to look differently, just slightly differently. Okay, so that's how that lays out. You can see that there's this one has two declarations in it, right? This body, this rule only has one declaration. This rule only has one declaration, but this rule has two. So your rules can actually have as many declarations as you want inside them. You can change all the properties that you want. Similar here, we have unordered list, and this is going to be a list style type square. So this is going to change them from what they would normally be bullets, which are rounded, to squares. And we're looking at an unordered list. Okay, so that's what a CSS file might look like. You'll notice that for comments with CSS, we start the comment with a /*, and then we end it with a */. This is basically the same thing as the way JavaScript and C# and most of the C family does block comments. There are no single line comments as well in CSS. So there are only block comments like this in CSS. So CSS starts with /*, ends with */. That's a block comment, versus a block comment in HTML starts with less than, !, --, greater than. So you have to know what kind of comment you're using, or what kind of code you're commenting to use the appropriate comment syntax. Typically your IDE will help you with that. So for instance, with Visual Studio Code and several other IDEs, it's Control/ if you want to comment out this selected block of text. So we can see there's a kind of a comment on the header there. Okay, so let's look at styling. Here we talked about a few rules. Each of these rules are what we would call type selectors, because their selectors are based on the type of tag. We can also use selectors that select based on the ID or the class. Okay, so for instance, here we've added a class base color to this header. We've added an ID links to this unordered list. We've added an ID copyright to this paragraph down here, as well as class base color, right? So any rules that we use that refer to ID links will refer to this, ID copyright would refer to this, and base color would refer both to the header and the copyright, because both of those have the same class. Okay, so for instance, if we're looking at the different kind of selectors, right? So here we've got a body selector. See, that's going to refer to the body tag. This is going to refer to any H1 that we have on the page. Here we can refer to an ID. Now when we refer to an ID, notice that we put the hash mark in front. Okay, so the hash mark in front refers to, instead of referring to ID copyright. Okay, so this one would only refer to this tag here, which has that ID, rather than referring to a tag like a copyright tag. It's referring to the tag with the ID copyright. Similarly with classes, classes start with a dot. So no prefix for type selectors, a hash mark for ID selectors, and a dot for class selectors. So this will apply the color blue to both that header as well as the copyright. Okay, so for example, that's what this would look like. So we've changed both of these to blue. We changed the copyright to a smaller font size and moved it to the right. And what else did we do with the body and the H1? With the H1, we made it a slightly bigger font. So that's how all that worked. Okay. If we're working with so this screenshot's with brackets. So let me go over to Visual Studio Code and we'll talk about how to do the same thing here. So if I want to open up an example, I can go to, say, File, Open Folder, and I can then track down to the particular folder that I want to open. So in this case, I'm going to open up Book Apps. That's what they have here, Book Apps, Chapter 2. We're going to select that folder. That's going to bring us here. So there we can see all the files that are in that folder. Okay. So typically when you open the folder, you'll want to open it up to the root of whatever project you're working on. I can typically open any folder. So for instance, if I go up to here, just to Book Apps and select folder, that will put me in here and I'll be able to see each of the chapters. But I don't want to do this because what'll happen is if I then say, let's run this through live server plugin, what you'll see is that it's at the root, right? So the root now is at this root. It's in the Book Apps folder, right? So if I go to, say, jQuery this, you see the path now, the path to it includes chapter 1, right? So that may cause some issues when you're defining the path to resources in your application. So when you're testing these applications, you want to make sure that you only have one project open at a time, right? If you open it like this with all of them at the root like this, you're going to have some issues where your paths will work differently because here they're rooted at Book Apps versus if you open it up to, and chapter 1 is there, versus if I were to switch this, open folder, go to chapter 2, and now go live, you'll see that chapter 1 is not, chapter 2, chapter 1 is not part of the URL. So when you're opening up the projects, please make sure to open it up to the correct root folder of that project. Otherwise, you're going to have some issues where your relative URLs will not work properly. And especially it won't work once you go to deploy it. So you want to think about where's the root of that website. Okay. All right, so we can open up a file there. Cool. Talked about that. To add extensions to Visual Studio Code, we're going to go down here to this icon, extensions, and then you can search for the one you want to include. So right now it's showing me all the ones I've already installed. If I wanted to say look for one that supports FTP, and type that in there, it'll go give me some options, and you can see that I haven't installed these extensions yet. But I could just click on install, then it would be installed. Okay, so that's how we get to extensions there for Visual Studio Code. One nice thing with Visual Studio Code brackets, most IDEs and good text editors will give you these suggestions, these hints. So if I start typing here, So for instance, you can see it'll get, as soon as I start opening the tag, it'll give me suggestions like there's an address tag. So if I start typing address, you'll see it'll give me a hint. Oh, it's address. All right. I can hit enter. It'll complete the tag for me. And if I close it like this, it'll even add the ending tag. So that's one of the benefits of using a more modern text editor or IDE is it'll do some of those code completion or code hints for you rather than having you do everything by hand, which you would do with, say, just Notepad. Okay, so that's some of the benefits of using an editor. Again, most IDEs as well as text editors support that, but not typically the ones that you just come in pre-installed with your operating system. Okay, so I can do that. I can also get hints on the CSS. So if I go over here and let's say I want to change the color, as I start typing, you'll see that it already gives me hints, color, and they'll give me some suggestions as well as for color constants that I can use. So if I want to say coral, I can add that in, pick that, hit enter, it'll select it, and it even gives me a little block here that kind of tells you what is that color going to look like. It gives you a preview of the color, which is nice. So I'm going to take that out. Next. Now, one thing I should mention while we're in Visual Studio Code, I probably should mention how to start a new file. So if I go over to, let's say we create a file from scratch. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go over, create a new folder. So let's say open folder. Or actually, I'll use one that's already there. So I'm going to go over back to base, lab, and homework. This would be your repo. We're going to go into the homework folder. I'm going to go into chapter 1. In chapter 1, I'm going to say select folder. And here, so if you go into homework 1, you'll see that there's already an index.html file created. I needed that so it would actually it would create the folders for you. In Git, if you don't add if you don't add any files to a folder in Git, then Git will just not include that folder in the repo. It's just say, oh, okay, it's got no files. I might as well just delete that repo. So it did have to have a file in there. Now I'm going to quickly delete this so you can see how you would create this yourself. So if I've got a brand new empty folder, I'm going to say create a new file. We're going to call this index.html. Because typically, if you don't specify which page to open, index.html is kind of the default page that it opens. We'll see that in a minute. So in here, I want to then create an HTML file. And I could start by writing out all the text, but let me show you a shorthand to get started. So if you type in an exclamation mark, you'll see that there's a suggestion. There's an Emmet abbreviation. So I'm going to go ahead and click enter. There we go. So all you have to do to get started with an HTML file is you just type an exclamation mark and enter. And it will go ahead and add the doc type, the HTML, the head tag, as well as the body tag. So it'll get you started. So let's use this to create a very simple page. Okay, I'm going to start with just this. And let's say we go live. So you'll notice, what does it say up here at the top? It says document, right? And there's no content currently in the page. Okay, well let's fix the problem of there being no content. So I'm going to add an h1 tag. h1 home page. save it. You'll see it immediately updates. And I'm going to add a paragraph with some lorem ipsum in here. So type in lorem, hit enter. Go back, save that. Lorem ipsum is just some basic placeholder text to see how things would look. Okay, so that's that. Let's go ahead and change the title, because you can see it still says document there. I'm going to change it to my home page. Save it. There we go. Okay, so that's your basic start to a web page. And the biggest thing to remember here is exclamation mark and then enter will start laying out that basic structure of the page. Okay? And that works as long as you've made the extension .html. I think if you don't get that right extension in the file, if I just called it index, then that emit doesn't work. So for instance, if I go here, index, see I've called it index instead of index.html, exclamation mark, well, enter, it doesn't know that it's, because it doesn't have the file extension HTML, it doesn't know that it's HTML, and it should suggest that. So make sure that when you're creating your HTML files that you actually give them that .html extension, because otherwise things won't work for a lot of reasons. Okay, that is what I wanted to go over there. I can also add in some CSS. So let's quickly add in some CSS just to test that part. So I'm going to say new file, main.css. In here, why don't we make the body, why don't we make it a slightly different color? So I'm going to make it background gray, or maybe make it pink. There. So I'm going to make the background pink. I definitely need to spell it correctly. Okay. So I'm going to make the background pink. Well, you notice I've saved it. Nothing's happened, right? So I still need to link that file up. So here in the head, I'm going to add a link tag, link rel style sheet. href tells it which was the name of the file, name of the style sheet. So main.css, and this is an empty tag, so it doesn't need, there we go, doesn't need a closing tag. So now it's changed to pink because I have this here. Now let's say you forget to type in the rel style sheet, or you just leave it off, right? So let's say I leave it off. You'll see that it's not applied. If I maybe misspell it, you'll see it's also not applied. So I need to make sure that I type that, add that rel style sheet and type it correctly. Okay. Now, typically we will store our CSS files and our JavaScript files in subfolders. So for instance, here I'm going to create a new folder and call it CSS. I'm going to add another folder for my JavaScript. So typically I'll put my CSS in the CSS folder, and I'll put my JavaScript in the JavaScript folder. Now, once I did that, you see that it immediately broke. It's not bringing in that style sheet anymore. So to bring in that style sheet, I need to then point it at CSS. I need to point it at that folder. So CSS/main.css, because it's in that folder instead of being in the root. So that's how that works. If I want to say add some styling to the H1, maybe we make it color navy, and let's make it much bigger. So let's say font size is 300%. There we go. So that's going to make it 3 times as tall. Okay, so that's a basic introduction to how to set up the HTML and the CSS within Visual Studio Code. Okay. So back to the slides. So some common errors that you may run into as you're writing CSS and HTML. Whenever you're writing an opening tag, make sure you include a closing tag. As you saw, Visual Studio Code will automatically add the closing tag for you most of the time. So that helps a lot, but you want to make sure that every opening tag has a corresponding closing tag. Be careful to not misspell the tag name as well as the attribute names. That will cause you some issues, even if they're just one character off. That will be a problem. With the tag names and the attribute names, please make sure that they're all lowercase. The one exception to that rule, as you saw with the HTML, is we typically do this as uppercase. Doc type is usually uppercase. Everything else is usually lowercase, both for tag names as well as attribute names. Technically, it's case insensitive with both of those things, but the current convention is to make those things lowercase, simply because it takes a lot less keystrokes to do and maintain. So common errors with CSS, you want to make sure that your brackets are paired correctly. Anytime you have a rule, it has to have both an opening bracket to start the rule after the selector, and has to have a closing bracket after the end of the selector. Another thing to remember with CSS is anytime you have more, especially if you have more than one rule, you always need to end these with a semicolon. So for instance, if I didn't end this rule here with a semicolon, I'm going to go and remove that semicolon. You can already see it's complaining. Notice that this whole rule is now not applied because I'm missing a semicolon there. So those are things to keep in mind. Make sure you're spelling the property names correctly. You saw what I was doing there when I had the name misspelled. So I left out maybe the C. I just said background. You can see that it's in yellow and it's telling me, hey, this is not right. So make sure you type the names correctly. Spell them correctly. Another thing to do once you're applying IDs and classes, you need to make sure that the ID and class that you have in the ID or class that you have in the HTML matches the ID or class that you have in the CSS file. If those don't match up, well, then that CSS won't be applied, or won't be applied correctly. Okay. You can also, in most IDEs, including brackets, including Visual Studio Code, you can look at more than one file at once, side by side. So for instance, if I'm working with both the HTML as well as the CSS, it can be helpful to look at them next to each other. So the way I do that is I take this and drag it, and you can kind of see it's already changed, but if I drag it over to the right side, there we go. That's all you got to do. If you want to look at two documents side by side, you just take the tab, and drag it to where you want it to be. So now I have half of my screen devoted to the HTML, half of my screen devoted to the CSS. That can be really, really helpful, especially when it comes to then dealing with the JavaScript, where you may want to have the JavaScript and the HTML side by side and things like that. So keep that in mind. You can do that. Live preview, we talked about how to get there. In brackets, it was this icon here. With Visual Studio Code, it's this Go Live button here, which is now turned into port 5500 because I'm running currently in the browser here. So that's basically how you go live. You can also, if I remember right click this, file once you are live and say open with live server, right? So if I, for instance, close this down, I can just right click it again here and say open with live server, and it will open it here. Okay. So there's a few different ways to run a web page once you've got it on your computer. You can open it through some browsers. You can double click it on the file system to open it in the browser, or if you're using Brackets or Live Studio, you can use it through the live server tool. I would recommend most of the time for your testing, the best way for you to test is going to be to use live server to test it locally. So that would be down here. So hit go live and test it that way. Once it's in the web page and running, so you make changes here. Under some cases, you go live and have it running. So under some cases, it won't necessarily refresh. As you can see with live server, the way that this is set up, anytime I make a change here, it's automatically refreshing it. But that doesn't always work. So the way that you can refresh it otherwise, you can hit reload here, or you can hit F5 on your keyboard to refresh it, or if you do Control F5 on your keyboard, that will do a hard refresh. That will, if you just do a simple refresh with F5 or the refresh button, it will just go pull down the edge. It will typically only pull down the HTML and only pull down files that it thinks have changed. Versus if you do Control F5, it'll say, okay, everything that I see on this page is invalid, throw it all away, and pull down all the files again. So that can be really helpful sometimes, especially when you're making changes to the CSS. Sometimes those aren't directly picked up from the browser, as well as especially CSS, sometimes JavaScript. Usually CSS is the problem, is the gotcha there. Especially if you're working with, say, IE. IE has a bad habit of not picking up your CSS changes unless you hit a Control F5 to force refresh it. And as you saw with Live Server, some IDs and plugins will automatically refresh it for you. We call that kind of hot swapping is the name of that. Okay. As far as testing that, you'll want to test your web pages and all the browsers that you think your users will use. So right now, top two being Chrome and Safari. You want to check that the contents and the appearance of the page is good on all those browsers, because you don't want them to, maybe it's like, oh, I can use it on this browser, but I can't use it on that browser. You want to go through as you're testing it, you want to go through all the links on every page to make sure it works. Remember that each page is a separate HTML file, so for instance, a link to your home page might work on one page, but might not work on your other two pages. So you do have to test all of the links on all of the pages. As far as debugging your code, once you found out that there's a problem, whether it be in your HTML or your CSS code, you'll want to go back to that and change it, test it again. That's basically how that works. One thing that we can do specifically with HTML is we can validate it. That will check that certain rules have been followed and give us an error if they're not. So let's say I run the file that I have right here that we created. Let's say we run this file, this HTML, through that validator. So let's see, validator w3.org. w3.org. All right, I'm going to say validate by file upload, And we're going to choose this file that I have here. So projects, homework. Okay, so I'm going to run the index HTML that I have here through that. And check. All right. It says document check complete. No errors or warnings to show. So everything that I have in there is correct. Now, let's say I comment out the doc type tag. Let's see what happens if I do that. So let's choose it again. Check. Well, there's an error, right? So it says start tag seen without seeing a doc type first, right? So it's telling us you really need to have this doc type as your first line. Okay, that's good. What if we try one of those examples that was nested badly? So let's say we put a paragraph tag in here, P, and I'm going to then start it with some text, some more text, EM test. So if I don't nest correctly, right, remember this EM tag should actually be inside of the P, right? Okay, so that's what I'm going to see here. Let's also say I leave off a paragraph, a closing tag. So here I've got bad nesting, and here I have a missing closing tag. Okay, let's try to upload this again. Check. Okay, so what errors did we get? So it says end tag P seen before there were open elements, right? So it's saying, hey, there's a problem here with this P because it doesn't correspond with an opening P. Well, that's, again, bad nesting. So a similar thing here, we see, okay, EM is not closed because, again, bad nesting. So both of these errors, that we didn't see an opening P, as well as that we have an unclosed EM, both of those are down to bad nesting. And then we see a similar thing here. So actually all three of the errors that we're seeing are due to bad nesting. So let me fix that error, fix the nesting, and that should fix those problems. So let's re-upload it. Okay, so it actually didn't complain about a missing closing tag, right? So you can see that some of these errors, some things, HTML is a little bit permissive on. P tags should always have closing tags, but that's not necessarily mandated. It's not something that will show up as a validation error. Now, let's say I do that same thing with a div tag. Will that give me an error for the div tag? Okay, there. So the div tag, it did complain that needs a closing tag. So you'll see some odd behavior like that, and that goes back to the reason that it doesn't complain about the P not having a closing tag is that old web pages used to write P tags without closing P tags. That's not the standard expectation anymore, but there is old code out there on the internet that still is written that way, where it starts a P tag, but it doesn't close the P tag. Okay. So let's fix this now so that we're back to working /div. So I'm going to start my tag and close my div. Let's check that again. Okay, so no errors now. Now, why don't we check the CSS? So I can also check my main.css file and see if it's valid. So for instance, if I go to, let's see, jigsaww3.org, w3.org, is that right? Oh, /CSS validator. Okay. So go to the CSS validator. There's what I want. So I'm going to upload my CSS. It's under the CSS folder there. Let's check it. All right, cool. Congratulations, no error found. So that's great. If I maybe leave off a semicolon here, let's try that again. Check. There. Okay. Sorry, we found the following errors. Value error color missing a semicolon before the property font size, right? So it's saying, okay, you're missing a semicolon before font size starts. Okay, so that will give you some indication with what errors you might have with your CSS as well as your HTML, and that can be helpful. The expectation for your first several assignments is that you should validate the HTML and the CSS for all of those and turn that in as a screenshot, just to make sure that you're writing writing valid HTML, writing valid CSS, and helping you debug some of those issues. So that's that as far as CSS, as far as the validators are concerned. One thing I want to mention before we close this up is talking about whitespace. So when I'm dealing with HTML, it's typically expected that we indent our tags. So, and I can do a format here. Right click, format document. It looks like, there we go, it formatted it this way. So that will bring it down. With HTML, you can put in as little or much white space as you want. Any sequence of white space characters that you have will always get collapsed down to, will generally get collapsed down to one white space character. So one of the things that means is if I'm writing this page, let's say I run this with live server, open with live server. So I'm looking at the page right now. If I add a bunch of spaces here, say Lorem Ipsum, bring that down. You'll notice that nothing changed over here. Nothing changed with the page. Well, again, as I was saying previously, any sequence of white space characters that you have will get collapsed down to one space. Okay, so whatever spacing you have here doesn't actually affect the space that's shown in the page. If I do want that to actually fall down, what I need to use is what's called a BR tag. So a BR tag will actually cause a break in that. So BR, and if I want 2 breaks, let's see, there. So you can see now that I put 2 breaks, it's pushed it down from lorem to ipsum, it's pushed it down 2 lines. Okay, so that's how you break it down if you need to introduce actual line breaks into the page. Otherwise, it's just going to ignore them and throw them away. Typically, when we're writing HTML, the expectation is you're going to indent at each level. So for instance, you see these tags are all in the head. So the expectation is that they'd be 2 spaces in there, indented with 2 spaces. If I don't indent, so for instance, if I go here, see all these spaces are optional. Let me actually do that. Yeah, all of that is optional. If I refresh the page, you'll see there's no difference. But good coding convention, good practice is generally considered to indent that 2 steps or 4 steps. I think 2 steps is what I've got my format settings to. for each kind of level of nesting. So the body tag is, these tags are all inside the body, these tags are all inside the head. If I had another layer of nesting, so inside of this div tag, maybe I had another div. Oh. Nested. So I might look at this like so. So I've got a div that's got some text, and then there's another div inside of it. So that nesting we would typically put at another level down. Okay. Similarly, when we're talking about CSS, the white space in CSS technically does not matter. You can remove all of the white space from here and it will work perfectly fine. In fact, it will be faster, which is where we get into something called minifying. But we want to have that white space in there as we're developing for readability. So you want to make sure that every declaration that you have in here should be indented 2 spaces from where the rule is. So like this is valid, this is a valid rule, that's valid syntax, but it's a lot more readable if we push it in and indent it. So please keep proper indentation as you're writing both your CSS and your HTML. Okay, so objectives that we talked about here, we talked about how to use a text editor, namely Visual Studio Code, to both create and edit HTML as well as CSS. We talked about how to test it using Live Server in your browser. We talked about using the W3C validation services both for HTML as well as for CSS. We explained what the purpose of the head and the body elements is. Remember, the head is for metadata and the body is for the actual content of the page. Okay. We talked about opening tags. We talked about closing tags. We talked about empty tags. We talked about adding attributes to some of our tags. We talked about how comments as well as white space work. And then we talked about how to write CSS rules and how to use different types of selectors. We talked about basic type, ID, and class selectors. And then we remember that type don't start with a prefix, the ID starts with hash, and the class starts with a period. We talked about a few ways to run and test our application, specifically using Live Server, the Live Server extension in Visual Studio Code. And then we also talked about, how to do that validation. Okay. That is the end of Chapter 2. Your reading assignments for Chapter 2 are up on Perusal, as well as your homework and lab assignments are up on Inside Riken. Remember, those are due at the end of the week. All right. Thank you.